of our study through Revelation. Now, those of you that watch on Facebook, and we have several folks that do, we will have lesson 18. I'll have a sort of an abridged version of that. We had just a little bit of a technical difficulty last week. Power went out right before the service, so that meant all the computers and everything went down and stuff just didn't work. But I promise we will put something on there. That way you won't feel like you're behind from lesson 18. And it was kind of a big one. And I was looking back through last week's lesson, and man, we got a little snippet of Armageddon. And we got to look at a few things, some angels and their messages. So we'll definitely put that on there. And then I've had a few folks that have asked about getting copies of the notes, the slides that we do. And we're more than happy to mail those out. And we'll get them to you if you want them. And if you send us a message or call the church, we'll definitely get them to you. So, but lesson 19, if you look in Revelation, the book of Revelation, you start in chapter 1 and you go to chapter 22, and all the chapters are about the same size. They all average in length from 20 to 30 verses, somewhere in there. But then you have Revelation chapter 15, and it is only 8 short verses. And I think God worked that out perfectly, that we got here and we postponed business meeting night because it is a short lesson, because it's the shortest chapter in Revelation. And God said, I will have mercy on you and not make you stay till 9 o'clock for the business meeting. So see, everybody can breathe a big sigh of relief, because you're thinking, man, he's going to teach for 45 minutes or 55 minutes. And I still may, I don't know. But there's not as much material in Revelation chapter 15. But let's just dive right in this evening. That way we can get right to the lesson. And in lesson 19, we're going to look at 3 things. There's only 3 things that we see in these 8 verses. We see another sign in heaven. We see the song of Moses. And then we see the vials of God's wrath. Now, we won't get into those vials this evening, but this is going to show us when those vials come out in heaven and what it's like right before they begin to be poured out. Now, before we get in too far into the lesson, I just want to clarify something. We've seen seal judgments and trumpet judgments. Now, vial judgments are also called bowl judgments. So we don't have vial and bowl judgments. It's just vial/bowl. Now, when we get into the vial judgments and we get into chapter 16 next week, we'll see why they're called both, because they're actually referred to as both. So I just wanted to clarify that. But another sign in heaven, in Revelation 15 and verse 1, it says this, and I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. So here in Revelation 15 and verse 1, John starts this chapter by saying, and I saw another sign. Now what this is, it is a distinction between the previous portion of the vision that John was having and this portion of the vision. Now if you remember last week, we stopped off and we got a little snippet of Armageddon. We didn't go into it in great detail because we want to do that in one big lesson. And we'll look from there and then in the future text and put it all together. But we got this snippet of Armageddon. We saw the lion or the lamb on Mount Zion with 144,000. We heard these angelic messages. And then we saw Armageddon. But then at the beginning of chapter 15, John is like, pause. He says, and I saw another sign in heaven, meaning that this is the beginning of a different portion of the vision. You see, in the Bible, John wrote this as a letter. This was one huge letter that he wrote to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. There was no chapter 14 or chapter 15. So in his writing, as he was writing, it would almost be like a new paragraph, and he would start there. And this is something else I saw in the vision. So that tells us that vision of Armageddon has ceased. And now we see something that he calls, quote, great and marvelous. Now, literally every single thing that John saw up until this point could be described as great and marvelous. Everything. From his very first encounter on Patmos until he heard the voice saying, come up higher, when he saw Jesus walking. Every single thing that he has seen has been great and marvelous. But I believe that he describes this particular moment as great and marvelous because he realizes that this is the beginning of the end of the judgments. Because he knows there's something that has changed in the vision. There's something that's changed in the atmosphere. And all of a sudden, he has described things as amazing and great and all that. But this portion of the vision, he says, it is great and marvelous. And I think that's because John knows, he's very aware, he's acutely aware that all of these plagues, all this judgment is coming to an end. But then we see in this first verse, what we see, something great and marvelous. He sees 7 angels. Now, these 7 angels are the ones that are going to pour out the last 7 plagues on the earth. These 7 angels are the last 7 that God will use. Remember, God has used angels all throughout in every single plague. In the seal judgment, seal would be broken, an angel would act. In the trumpet judgments, an angel would stand and blow a trumpet. So just as before, we see that there will be 7 angels used. And then at the end of verse 1, it says something very interesting. It says, "For in them is filled up the wrath of God." Now, in other words, what this means is the last 7 plagues, that these are the last 7 plagues of God's judgment on the earth, and then the judgment will be complete. His judgment on the earth. His judgment on the lost never ends. But this portion of tribulation, when we get to the end of these vile judgments, all of God's wrath on the earth will be complete. It will be the end of what we know as a great tribulation. Also, you can think of it in this way. When it says that in them is filled up the wrath of God, we can look at that as saying, okay, that when this is done, then the judgments are done and it will be complete. And also that for in them is filled up the wrath of God, that every single one of these judgments, we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit, every single one of these 7 judgments is pure, unadulterated wrath. And it's only filled with the wrath of God. But then in Revelation 15:2, we see this. "And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass, mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God." So here in verse 2, we see this sea of glass mingled with fire. Now, if you'll remember, way back in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 6, we see this sea of glass mentioned initially. In Revelation chapter 4 verse 6, it says this, "And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal." So this is the same sea. So John is seeing that sea of glass that's in the throne room of God. Now that sea of glass, we didn't dwell on it a whole lot when we went through Revelation chapter 4, but a lot could be said of it. One, the gold that's in heaven, people talk about how the streets of gold, it's such a pure gold you can see through it. It's clear. But this sea of glass, what it's representing and what it is looking at is actually the peace that God's church will have in heaven. The peace, it's a tranquil sea of glass. It's completely still. It's completely beautiful. It's completely transparent. And also God's throne, there it sets, and it's just this image of perfection that you see in God's throne room. But here in this portion, this sea of glass says that it is now, quote, mingled with fire. Now this shows that God's wrath is reaching its crescendo. So this sea of glass is perfect. Just think of the most perfect steel pool of water you've ever seen, probably in a picture somewhere. Because if you look at the Ohio River, it's nothing but a sea of mud. But just think of one of those reflective lakes you've seen, this perfect sea of glass. But now, at this portion in time, it's mingled with fire. And what that fire is showing us is that God's wrath is coming to a boiling point. And you have to remember, at this point in time, we've already seen over half of the earth's population has been killed. And God has done some really powerful things to the earth. We've seen him unleash some really powerful plagues on the earth. But this moment in time, this is the end act. If you have a beginning. Remember those? I can't remember if it was Reading Rainbow or one of them that said every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. We're approaching the end of Revelation. The beginning, the middle, but now we're coming to the end. We're coming to what you would call the third act. And so this is showing that God's wrath is reaching its all-time heights that he's going to pour out on the earth. And then we see the victors. We see the sea of glass, but then we see the victors mentioned. And it says, them that had gotten victory over the beast and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name stand on the sea of glass having harps of God. First off, I want you to notice these victors have gotten victory and they're dead. They're in heaven. So remember, death is not defeat for a Christian. It is victory for a Christian. It says that they've gotten victory over the beast and his mark and all these things that happened in the tribulation. It doesn't mean that they whipped him. It means they died and went home. It means that as the axe fell down and killed them, or as the bullet went through them, when they died, they gained victory, and God calls them victors. He says that the victors are standing there. I want you to notice, too, that the victors are standing. Victors always stand. You don't see anybody sitting on the podium at the Olympics. They stand proudly. That's why these men and women are standing, because they're victors and they're standing there before God. And right before this final wrath is poured out, there they stand with their harps in their hand. So yes, harps in heaven is a biblical tenet. We've already seen them mentioned twice in the book of Revelation. So yes, will you have a harp in heaven? Well, we know these folks have harps. So yes, harps is a biblical tenet. But we're going to find out why they have those harps. And while they're standing there and they're anticipating God's coming judgment here in the next few verses. And we see that they have these harps in Revelation 15:2. Says this, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. So they're not just standing there looking pretty with their harps in their hand. They begin to play them, and they begin to sing a song before the Lord. Now we have to stop for just a few moments, and we have to look at this song of Moses. If you look in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 1, you'll see a familiar account of Moses leading the children of Israel across the Red Sea. And remember, the Egyptians were behind them, and they were pressing upon them, and the Red Sea was in front of them. And they were panicked, and they thought they were going to die. And oh, you brought us out in the wilderness to die. And Moses gives one of the greatest lines that any pastor could ever say, be still and know that he's God. Sit down and shut up. God's going to do something. And he goes out, and God says, stick your staff over. He sticks his staff out. The Red Sea parts, and what seems like an impossible situation becomes possible with God, and they walk through on dry ground. You remember that, right? We've all been to Sunday school. Well, in Exodus 15:1, as soon as they get over, and then the walls of the water come down, and it kills all the Egyptian army, including Pharaoh, I believe. It kills the Egyptian army, and as soon as they see this, what do? They begin to sing a song of praise to God. Why do we sing in church? Why do we sing? Why is that part of our worship? Because it has been from the beginning of the worship of God, and we have seen them sing no less than 3 songs in heaven at this point. There's going to be a lot of singing in heaven. So in Exodus 15:1, the children of Israel sing this song after they're brought over. So this song of Moses, in essence, what it is, it's a song of victory and praise and deliverance. And they just sing praises to God that just brought them out of an impossible situation. Isn't it poignant? Isn't it fitting that these that have just come through the tribulation and God has brought them up and delivered them and given them victory, they sing a rendition of Moses' song to God. But if you look here in Revelation 15 and verse 3, it says this, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. So it's not just the song of Moses that the Egyptians sung. This is the remix, because they didn't know who Jesus was in Moses' time. But here they're singing the song, and they're including praise specifically to Jesus Christ and what he has done for them. So it says they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glory thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, and for thy judgments are made manifest. Now that's a song. And here these saints stand before God, playing on their harps, singing this song of praise and victory. These that have suffered so greatly for the cause of Christ now sing in anticipation of what God's about ready to do. So as we see that song of Moses, and stay tuned, there might be a sermon preached out of Exodus 15 soon. As that song is being sung, we see these vials of wrath, and they're unveiled. In Revelations 15, 5 through 6 is this. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in purple and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. So let's take a look here and break down these couple verses. The temple in heaven is open. Now remember, there's a temple in heaven, and the temple on the earth is patterned after the temple in heaven. When God gave Solomon the plans to the temple that he built, it is emulating what's already in heaven. So all of those things, we talked about this at length before, the altar of incense, the table of showbread, the Ark of the Covenant, all those things that man had on the earth in the temple is patterned after something that's in heaven that God has in the temple, the heavenly temple. Now you have to remember that during the tribulation, we haven't talked about this a whole lot, we'll get into it in coming weeks, but during the tribulation, we've talked about how the Antichrist will be worshipped as God, and the false prophet will step up and he'll cause everyone to worship the beast. And what's going to end up happening ultimately, we talked about the image of the beast, he's going to go into the new temple. The Jews are going to build a temple there in Jerusalem. And he's going to go into that temple and he's going to set up in that temple and he's going to proclaim himself God and demand worship. And the image of the beast will be worshipped in the temple. So what you have to look at is what's happening here. During the tribulation on earth, they're blaspheming in the temple, in the earthly temple. During the same time in heaven, God's final judgment is coming out of the temple. It is not lost on God all the blasphemy that's going on the earth. It's not lost on God that the world at large is worshiping the Antichrist in their temple, in their tribulation temple. It's not lost on God that all this religion is being poured out onto someone that is actually under the power and influence of Satan. So it is no mistake that God brings his last 7 judgments, which are probably his most powerful, out of the temple in heaven. Because what's going on in the temple in earth during this time, you see God showing his force of power and what he's going to do coming out of the temple. So when the temple in heaven is open, we see this. And then there's a phrase here that says the temple of the tabernacle of God. And that refers to God's promise to Israel and really to the world, to all Christians, that he is their coming king and that he will come and worship and he will reign and rule as the king of the earth. So when it says the temple of the tabernacle of God, that's just reiterating the promise that God made that he is coming back and that he will rule and reign the earth with a rod of iron. And it's also in reference, if you look into that phrase and what it's translated from, the temple that and the tabernacle of God is talking actually about the Holy of Holies. It's a reference to the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant set. So really, when these 7 angels come out of the temple in heaven, the heavenly temple, they're actually coming from that Holy of Holies. Now, if you remember on the earth, the only people that were allowed in the Holy of Holies was the high priest once a year to go and make sacrifice for the people's sins. I believe also in that Holy of Holies in heaven, that's where the Ark of the Covenant sits, and that's where Jesus Christ sprinkled his blood on the mercy seat, just like the priest would do on the earth. So they're coming out of God's inner circle, if you will. They're coming out of his inner sanctum. So these 7 angels coming out of the temple, let's look at them quickly. 7, of course, we've talked a lot about how it represents perfection. It's the number of perfection. It's the sign of completion and perfectness. They're clothed in purple and white linen. Now, this represents the holiness, the purity, and the royalty of God that is sending them. This isn't in reference to their holiness and purity and royalty. It's in reference to God who is sending them. It's like their uniform. Like whenever you're a member of the United States Army and you wear that snazzy uniform and you have all of those insignias and everything on it, everything you're wearing does not represent you. It represents the United States Army and the United States government. It's not a representation of how great you are, but how great the country you serve is. It's the same thing here. They're clothed in purple and white linen, showing and representing that they're going to be sent as representatives of God's holiness and purity and royalty. And the golden girdle, which is really a sash that it describes that goes across, it represents that they serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It shows God's royalty. It shows Jesus Christ is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So we see them coming out, and they're adorned unlike the other angels before them have been. And I believe it's because they do hold the last of the judgments that they're adorned in such a way. But then we see here, as we look through, when the 7 angels come out of the temple, let's go back to the scripture real quick. It says, "And I looked, and behold, and the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was open." Verse 6 is this. "And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in purple and white linen, having their breasts girded with the golden girdles." We just talked about that. Verse 7 says this. "And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who liveth forever and ever." So if you remember way back in Revelation 4, verse 6 through 8, remember we looked at those, they're referred to as the 4 beasts in heaven, or the 4 heavenly creatures in heaven, these types of angels that we saw, and they were full of eyes, remember, and they looked different, all of them. One of these 4 heavenly creatures, which we don't know which one, hands the angels the vials that are full of God's wrath. So it's a very ceremonial type of thing. They come out of the temple and they're all adorned and they're purple and they're white and they're gold, and then they're handed these vials that are full of God's wrath. And as they walk out and the beast hands them the wrath, I want you to notice some of the words here. It says, "Golden vials full of the wrath of God." Full, which is showing that each judgment is powerful, perfect, and complete. When I say full, I think that it's completely full. It's all the way to the top, brimming with God's wrath. And the wrath of God, once again, it's not mingled with grace or mercy. Remember, we talked about God's judgment being poured out, unmingled on the earth. How it's not mixed with anything. There's no grace. There's no mercy. It is pure God wrath. That's what these angels are handed. Vials full of God's wrath. I would imagine, if you will, if you were driving a truck and it had like an atomic bomb in the back. I mean, that's what they're handed. They're handed God's wrath. I bet they handle it real carefully, and they're real respectful of what they're handed. Verse 8 says this, "And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled." So we see here that smoke fills the temple. This shows the glory and power of God. I put some references for you here. If you've ever heard that phrase, holy smoke, that's actually sort of taking the Lord's name in vain, because there is such a thing as holy smoke that's spoken of in Isaiah 6, verses 3 through 4, Exodus 19, 16 through 18, Exodus 40, verse 34 through 35. This smoke is always spoken of and shows us what we call the Shekinah glory of God, the power of God, God's presence. So this smoke fills the temple, and no one in heaven will be allowed into the temple until these 7 bowls of wrath are poured out upon the earth. It's going to be a very sad occasion. Remember, we saw silence in heaven right before all of these judgments. This is going to be a time when the temple doors close and no one's going to be allowed in save those 7 angels as they pour out all of this wrath on the earth. Next week, we'll start to look at these 7 vials or these 7 bowls, and we're going to see what they are. The last slide you have there, just to give you an idea of these 7 bowls of judgment we're going to see in the next little bit. We see the first bowl is sores that afflict those who accepted the mark of the beast. And then the second, the sea turns to blood, and all sea creatures die. Now we're going to look at how this corresponds to a previous judgment. If you can remember that waters have already been affected at one point in time, but now all the waters are affected. And then the third, we see the salt water, and then we see the fresh water. The rivers all turn to blood. Then we see mankind will be scorched by the sun. Now, if you remember, this is also a correlation, and when we'll look at this, when God sort of turned down the sun. I said that the sun kind of got turned down a few notches. Well, now it's going to be turned up even hotter. Interesting fact for one of our signs of the time lessons. If you happen to notice that your cell phone's not working very well, it's because we are experiencing some of the biggest solar flares in the history of mankind since they've been measuring such things. Not saying that we are in the middle of tribulation, but saying all those things that lead up to God using practical things during his judgment. Then we'll see the 5th bowl. The beast's seat of government is afflicted, and we'll talk about that. We mentioned Babylon and the fall of Babylon. We're going to talk at length about Babylon and what that means. And then we see the 6th bowl. The Euphrates River is dried up, and the world's armies gather together, march down the dry riverbed to a place called Megiddo for the valley of Armageddon. And then in verse 7, or in the 7th bowl, we'll see the earth is utterly shaken. We'll talk a whole lot about that. So this is what we'll be looking at over the next few weeks. Chapter 15 is very brief, and it kind of gives us just a little bit of a glimpse of what is to come. It kind of sets up, you literally have in verse 1 through 8 of chapter 15, it's all just a setup for chapter 16. John sees what is coming, and he knows that the end is near. We know that these vial judgments or bowl judgments, these are the last 7 judgments that God unleashes. We know that the first 14 have been pretty terrible. These are even worse. And you have to remember that all of these are unleashed during the time of what we call Great Tribulation. I believe during the last 3.5 years of the tribulation is when we will see these in rapid succession upon the earth. So while these are happening, you always also have to remember that the Antichrist is killing any Christian that's been converted, and the world is starving already, and money is worth nothing already. All of this is added on, insult to injury at the end. And then it will all culminate with this huge battle that we call Armageddon. We're going to talk about what it is, and we're also going to talk about, when we get to Armageddon in that 6th vial, we're going to talk about how that we have desensitized ourselves to words like Armageddon. And we've desensitized ourselves to things like the number 666, and how all of that, I believe, is part of the devil's plan. You know, it's going to be, it's not going to be as big a deal to go to the Valley of Megiddo to fight God because we've been desensitized to it for centuries. That it's not really going to happen, and this doesn't really mean anything. It's going to be rationalized away, I believe. But that's what we'll be looking at over the next at least 2 weeks, probably 3. And see, I told you, man, we got done like 15 minutes early.